honour for me and a pleasure to introduce my dear friend Sophie Panopoulos, whom I remember at the Constitutional Convention. She is the Liberal member for Indi, I think that's the correct pronunciation, since 2001, and is in the Shadow Ministry as the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Industry and Science Research, where she is playing a significant role, making significant comments in the media in the areas of her portfolio. She was educated at St Catherine's, Toorak, and at the University of Melbourne in the law school. And she is married to Lieutenant Colonel Greg Mirabella. For courage and principle, there has been no equal. She has been prepared to stand out for issues which at the time were not particularly popular, and in particular, constitutional monarchy. I remember during the referendum campaign that she went on a long tour of Queensland in a small plane with two very large men, Digger James and Senator Boswell. And they made a significant impact. The result was that of all our states, Queensland was the strongest in the referendum. I think that the number of seats that voted in our favour was well over 96%. I remember one evening in Sydney, I wasn't there, but I saw it on television. It was on the roof of a building in Sydney. There was a breeze blowing and it looked quite magical. And it was a debate which one of the television stations had organised concerning the referendum. I remember particularly that one of her opponents was Geoffrey Robertson, QC, Queen's Counsel, who decided on that evening to campaign against the sovereign who had given him his letters patent in the United Kingdom as a Queen's Counsel. And I remember on one particular occasion when she threw out the line which completely astounded and silenced the otherwise loquacious journalists. She said that Australians should be concerned not so much by what the House of Windsor might do to them, but what the House of Murdoch would do. The News Limited journalists quivered as they held their pens, thinking, I'd better not report that. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sophie Panopoulos.
Thank you, David. And some of you may have noticed that David called me by my maiden name. I think he's a bit overwhelmed by the news of what's happened in Western Sydney and with some riots over there, and has taken to the thrice denied form of divorce. And he's quite easily divorced me from Greg, and I've become Panopoulos yet again. But thank you for the great honour of inviting me to speak here this evening. My apologies for being late. I am suffering from a self-induced injury that's kept me away from Canberra this week, but it's a great pleasure to join so many friends and so many combatants in such an important battle. I was first asked to speak, and then I got a call a couple of weeks later and asked and said, well, can you actually speak on the symbols of monarchy under an Abbott government? Which I thought was a bit sneaky, having asked me to speak, having got my consent, and then dictated a title which could put me in a lot of hot water. So I'm going to be a bit sneaky back. I can't give you a definitive list of what we will do as an Abbott government to restore the symbols of monarchy. As tempting as it is to unilaterally announce policy in this area, it is highly inappropriate. But what I will do is give you my personal views as a member of Tony Abbott's shadow cabinet, and I assume, humbly so, as a member of an Abbott cabinet. I think it's very important when you try and look forward into the future to see what a particular administration might do, to look at the leader. And it's very important to understand what personal qualities that person has. I think the state of our nation at the moment is the poorer because of the deficient qualities of the current leadership. So what I can do is give you my insights into the man who will bear the burden and the responsibility of leading this nation. We can all obviously appreciate how important the Prime Minister of the day is in establishing the national agenda, and many of us will well remember John Howard, who kept his word and facilitated a constitutional convention and then a referendum in the late 1990s. He did it with transparency, and he did it by respecting the usual conventions regarding the compilation and distribution of material for both the yes and the no cases. And even though John Howard was and is a monarchist, he went out of his way to give both sides a fair go. And some of us monarchists believe he did too much for the other side. In fact, he bent over backwards to not only be fair, but to appear to be fair. Tony Abbott is someone who understands our history right through to the marrow of his bones. A true insight into the character of the man is that he has the humility to understand and accept that any one of us today cannot easily better the collective wisdom of the political and constitutional deliberations that have evolved over hundreds of years. This is why there is no better person to lead our nation and help us emerge from the denial of who we are and what we are as a nation, including the fact that we are a constitutional monarchy. It's this strength of character, purpose and deep intellect that differentiates Tony Abbott from all would-be Liberal leaders. He sees Republicans for what they are and is therefore immune to their shallow arguments that often find traction with intellectually lazy and/or egocentric politicians. This is why, after 25 years of involvement in Australian political debate, I've moved beyond the usual cynicism that besets one after all that time, and I am genuinely excited about the possibilities of our nation under an Abbott Prime Ministership. Sometimes you just have to have a bit of faith. You just have to believe in the possible. Just like so many of us did back in 1999 when we were outnumbered in terms of celebrities and we were, of course, significantly outspent. But we nailed our colours to the mast, we believed in our cause and we were victorious. What I can tell you today is that I have been working very hard and I will continue to do all that I can to ensure that the first Executive Director of ACM becomes the next elected Prime Minister of this country. Symbols for a nation are, of course, very important. They're often the visual shorthand reminder of our identity and our history. Some symbols may evolve over time to incorporate new events and new experiences. And just like our Constitution, symbols are not static in what they mean. The enduring power of symbols is why Republicans, having failed to change our Constitution, try to do so by stealth. They think by removing the reminders and symbols of our system of government, a constitutional monarchy, that we the people will forget what we are and where we came from. Then presumably it's easier to convince everyone of the monotonous, boring argument that a republic is inevitable. If they can't convince us of the merits of becoming a republic, then they'll try and bore us into submission. This is why it is important, and I do appreciate being given the title to speak about the symbols of a constitutional monarchy under an Abbott government, and do so from a very personal perspective. I do believe that the next Conservative government needs to rebuild some faith and pride in our institutions. And one way of doing so is to engender greater national pride in and universal recognition of the achievements of our fellow countrymen and women, whether they be Nobel laureates, philanthropists, military personnel, artists or sportsmen and women. I'm not talking about the restoration of imperial honours, I'm talking about the restoration of an unashamedly Australian knighthood. Why shouldn't we? Why shouldn't we honour and celebrate the success of our highest achieving Australians? Those amongst us who lead by example and show what we can do when we are our very best. I would like to see an Abbott government investigate the restoration of the rank of Knight and Dame in the Order of Australia. New Zealand has done it, no less by a Conservative but self-proclaimed Republican Prime Minister John Key. Understandably, Key's reversal of the decision of former Labor Prime Minister Helen Clark to scrap honours in 2000 has been very warmly welcomed by New Zealanders, as I'm sure many of you know and appreciate. From the abolition of knighthoods in 2000 to their restoration in 2008, 90 New Zealanders were awarded the highest New Zealand honour of the time and made Companions of the Order of New Zealand. Post-2008, Prime Minister Key gave all these recipients the choice of upgrading to a knighthood or to a dame. Unsurprisingly, over 90% went for the upgrade. Lifting the official ban on royal patronage is, I think, another symbolically very important thing that an Abbott government should do. Another example of the heavy hand of undemocratic Republicans has been the self-imposed ban on Australian organisations wishing to apply to the Palace for royal patronage. I believe this ban should be lifted. I mean, why shouldn't the members or executive of an organisation be prohibited from applying for such patronage? And it's interesting because this ban is just a small insight into the elitism of the Australian Republicans. They can't bear to allow people to act in the interests of their respective organisations if that means that these people act in a manner showing respect and acknowledging the value of the monarchy. Royal patronage can bestow benefits of recognition, much welcome publicity, including by the attention and or visits of members of the royal family. Whilst we continue to be a constitutional monarchy, royal patronage should be available to eligible organisations. Recently, as I read about the Girl Guides scrapping their allegiance to the Queen and God and removing the Queen's portraits from guide halls, I was quite disgusted and saddened. Allegiance to the Queen and God were replaced with the words, "to be true to myself and develop my beliefs." Well, whatever that means. And I mention it as an example of what can happen when Republicans are successful in changing long-standing tradition for the sake of changing. Well-known understood concepts are scrapped in favour of meaningless relativist drivel. Quite frankly, it is embarrassing. From a personal perspective, I know there's one organisation that my two gorgeous girls won't be joining. And it makes you wonder what's going to be next. Will kindergartens start banning role play of princesses and knights, replacing the contents of the dress-up box with the garb of a president who is true to himself? It's just awful to even contemplate, isn't it? But these things are happening right across our community with the support and acquiescence of Republicans who can't bear any symbolism, any sight, any recognition of what we are, which is a constitutional monarchy. And one of the first areas to be hit by this creeping republicanism, as it's often being referred to, is the removal of images of the monarch herself. I actually have a lovely portrait of the Queen in the boardroom of my electorate office, and I found it in one of those shabby chic / junk stores in Melbourne. It was an old, beautiful black and white photograph I hadn't seen anywhere else that had been painted over. So I bought it, had it restored and had it framed, and it now sits prominently in my boardroom because I want it to be a reminder to everyone who comes to see me who our monarch is. And it is an important symbol, and it's a beautiful portrait that I proudly display. And I also believe it's important to restore portraits of the monarch in official government buildings, including at our diplomatic posts overseas. I'm sure you can understand why I get a sinking feeling in my stomach when I'm travelling overseas on official duties and I visit one of our embassies, only to be greeted by a photograph of Julia Gillard, amongst others. I'm embarrassed and I cringe and I get a little sad being reminded of the new lows that our body politic has reached. The monarch's portrait in official buildings would be a constant reminder that any government of the day is exactly that, and a reaffirmation of the enduring work and the important tenet of impartiality of the public service. And the public service, these are the very people that will be critical to helping the next Conservative government, the next government, hopefully an Abbott government, implement the policies that can give a great people the quality of government and the policy that it deserves. So these are three very clear, symbolic areas that I do believe play an important role in reminding, remembering, reaffirming our constitutional foundation. And I'm sure if we do go down this path, there'll be lots of criticism, because obviously so many of the journalists in the Fairfax press will be reeling, their heads will be spinning 360 degrees, unable to comprehend what this all means, and Abbott prime ministership, just as they did when John Howard became Prime Minister. Do you remember some of them would say, if John Howard wins another election, I'll just have to slash my wrists. If John Howard wins another election, I'll just leave Australia for good. You'll have all those ridiculous, outrageous comments being made again. And there's something that John Howard and Tony Abbott share. This absolute aggression and hatred from so much of the left-wing media directed to both these two men is because they are highly effective in prosecuting the argument for the things that they believe in, that happen to be conservative values. And because they are effective, they won't be held hostage, they won't be cajoled into being de facto left-wing Labor leaders. And that's another exciting reason why in less than 12 months' time I hope we will have a change of government. And an Abbott government will be proudly independent and won't be burdened by cultural cringe. The pride in our nation doesn't exist in a vacuum, but necessitates the recognition of our history, our traditions and our achievements. And we've got a lot to be proud of. As a young country, and I'm sure you've heard this ad nauseum, but I'm going to repeat it again, as a young nation, we are one of the 6 longest continuous democracies in the world. And that didn't happen by accident. Being born out of the Westminster system was an absolute precondition to this stability. And long may we value and celebrate this good fortune. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's fallen to me to have the honour of moving the vote of thanks to Sophie Mirabella this evening. At the conclusion of World War II, it became fashionable among Frenchmen to claim that they had indeed been members of the French resistance. There were so many Frenchmen who'd claimed they had been members of the French resistance that in truth, had all those who'd claimed to be members of the French resistance actually been members of the French resistance, they would have kicked the Germans out a long time ago. In the same way today, it's become fashionable to claim that people are a friend of Tony Abbott's. And there are lots of people who claim to have been friends of Tony Abbott's. But indeed, our guest speaker this evening, Sophie Mirabella, really has been, is, and always will be a friend of Tony Abbott's. We've talked a little bit about that David Marr quarterly essay, and in it he tells the story of Tony's first press conference as leader. And he notes that there were a small band of colleagues that were there that day. And I remember, because I was in Western Australia on the day the leadership change happened, so I was watching it all on television, but I remember distinctly seeing Sophie there at that press conference as one of Tony's key supporters. And with that level of closeness to the next Prime Minister, who better than Sophie Mirabella to tell us tonight what Tony might be likely to do, without of course making any sort of policy announcement this evening, might be likely to do with relation to some of the symbols of the Crown that interest people here tonight. Sophie, I thought, made a very, very important point. She said at one point, the more effective you are, the more they will target you. And she said this in relation to Tony, but she could just as easily have said it in relation to herself. I think all of us who are here, who have known Sophie a long time, who have worked with her on this great cause of the constitutional monarchy in Australia, know what an effective advocate for that cause she has been, and also know what an effective advocate for liberalism and the political causes that she believes in, that she always has been. Sophie, you often know the quality of a person by the quality of their enemies. Can I say, on that basis, we judge you very, very highly indeed, and we are greatly honoured this evening that you spoke to us in the manner that you did. Please join me in thanking Sophie Mirabella in the usual way.